Hi, this is Tim from Garden Hands. Welcome to our channel if you're a first-time viewer, right? We're just going to start our 2022 maple syrup season. So if you haven't subscribed, that'd be great if you would. You follow us through our entire season. We're just a small family-operated sugar bush that does it for fun, as a hobby. We give away most of our maple syrup, it seems like. We sell a little bit to Roth over in Cadott, just a couple of small barrels of it. And the rest of it we bottle up and give away to our friends and neighbors. So we started this 6 years ago with, I don't remember if we had 10 pails and a small little turkey fryer, and we stood around that. It's about this big around, and 5 of us stood around that, or 6 of us. It was that big before I burned it. And we made a couple of quarts that year, I think it was. Anyway, we got hooked on it, and then we went to 50 trees, I think, the next year. We got about a 3x3 pan that we bought from somebody, and we made a little arch out of some cement and went from there. And the next year, then we kind of got a little bit more. We went up to 100, I think, and now we're at 300, 400, somewhere in there. Mostly, it's all pails. We don't do any lines. Our woods is real flat, so we don't get into putting lines out. It just isn't as good. And we have the pails, so we use them, and we have kids that like to pick up pails, so it works out good. So here's a maple tree. This one's been tapped. Here's a tap hole from probably last year, maybe 2 years ago. So eventually that will be gone. You won't see it. The bark will keep closing in on that, and you won't see that. As I said, this is a maple tree. It's about a foot across, maybe 14 inches. We generally don't tap them if they're under 10 inches in diameter. We have, but we try. We've got enough maples. We only tap maybe a quarter of what we have, so we can skip them a year or two even. It doesn't matter. Generally, a maple will have bark that's it'll be a little shaggy like this sometimes. That's not hurting the tree to do that. And as it goes up, there's a lot of branches branching off from it. There's some dots out here on trees, some blue dots, where we used to let someone else tap, and they put a little paint dot on the side of the tree in the fall so they could see the leaf in the fall, and then it's real easy to tell them. I guess I don't have trouble figuring out what a maple tree is, so we don't have to identify ours. So our second tree that we're at is a cherry tree. These have a real a shaggy kind of a bark it's just real shaggy. I don't know how to other word, scaly kind of, something like that. These grow, and as they go up, they don't have as many branches until you get right to the top. A lot of times there'll be a straight trunk, and they're not as good a tree in the woods. If a tree is going to break off or pull out by the roots in a storm, it'll be a cherry tree. Cherry trees are good for firewood. They're sort of a hardwood. They're not the hardest, but they're not the softest. If you get them dried and split and dried, they make pretty decent firewood. There's enough of them that we try to cut those as we go, because a lot of times you won't get one that's good enough for a log, for a saw log, for a sawmill. So we'll try and cut these and use these as firewood for fueling our maple syrup evaporator or for heating at home. Our next tree that we're looking at here is a hickory tree. Hickory is not for tapping at all. There's a lot of hickory in our woods. They seem to be almost like a weed. Hickory and basswood are almost like a weed. They grow pretty prevalent. The squirrels will harvest the nuts from these, or their fruit, in the fall, and they'll go store them in different places, and that's what seeds this tree. Excellent tree for firewood, and if you can get them cut without them splitting, get them cut down without splitting them, they're good for saw logs, also for sawmills. They do split easy when they are cut. When you fall one, it seems like a lot of times they will split because they have such a straight grain. They're pretty wood. But we'll harvest these, and a lot of times these will die out. They'll get a disease and die. So if they die, they'll stand a year or so, and they'll be just about dry enough to burn then, so they're good wood that way. But we try to harvest these because they'll grow tall enough and straight enough that they'll start to be a canopy for the smaller maples, so they'll kind of crowd those out a little bit. So we don't mind cutting these. They grow fast enough that you can cut these and try and hold it back so that we've got more room for canopy for our maple trees. These have a real smooth bark to them. They're pretty easy to identify. They don't have a real deep vein in them. They're very smooth. So they're pretty easy to identify. So our next tree that we have in the woods is another tree that I call it kind of a weed, is a basswood. So bark on the basswood tree will spread, it'll be a little bit apart, and then it'll almost look like it goes back together. Anyway, that's what the bark looks like on a basswood. And again, we're in west central Wisconsin, so that's what our trees are. A basswood is a softwood. It makes decent firewood. It just doesn't burn as long as a maple or a hickory or a cherry or an elm, but it isn't the worst firewood either. These will grow fairly straight up. Usually they grow in a clump. A lot of times you'll see 3 or 4, maybe 5 of these in a clump, and one will fall out, and then you'll have another one that starts. They grow right out of the roots. They're similar to a box elder that way, or I think they are. They'll grow right out of where a stump was cut off again. These don't do real good in a storm either. They'll blow over. Their roots aren't quite as good. But they grow fairly straight, and they don't have branches till they get up quite a ways on these either. They're similar to hickory and cherry that way too. So our next tree that we're going to identify, this is an oak. This one is too. And this is a cherry right behind me here. It doesn't grow and take, around here, it doesn't grow and take over a woods, where hickory and basswood will a little bit to some extent, but oak won't come right into a woods and start to grow without any control to it. It's slow growing. Squirrels will harvest the acorn nuts as they do the hickory nuts, so they'll move those around and they'll bury some of them, put some of them in trees or under trees for their winter, and then they don't always get them again, so these will start to grow from that nut. These have branches a little bit lower down. Here's a branch that was right here. They'll have branches a little bit lower down compared to a hickory or a cherry tree. These are a good tree, good for timber harvest is what we use them for, and what generally happens with them in the woods here. An oak tree, and this is a red oak. We do have some white oak in another section of the woods, but a red oak doesn't have anything that's real distinguishing with the bark. I mean, it can be similar to a maple, close. Usually it's a little bit darker, but here's a cherry tree right next to it that has that scalier bark. So there's definitely a difference between those two. And if you had a hickory standing here, that would have the smooth bark, and that would look for sure different. The next tree that we have in the woods, quite a few of them, they don't ever get real big, but is red elm. And I know everybody's going to say this is a dead elm, but this is red elm. It's got a kind of a finer, more of a, for the lack of better words, petite bark to it. It doesn't get real deep and shaggy. This is one tree, but it's got 2 branches kind of in the bottom. This part of it is dead, and they'll get like this, and the branches, it'll retain its branches until it falls over, and it'll stand here for 3 or 4 or 5 years dead like this. And when you do cut it, it's hard and it's dry. We'll try and leave it sit for a year just to season a little bit more. But these are excellent firewood, and they usually have a pretty fine, tight growth ring to them. But we have quite a few red elm. We have a little bit of white elm, or sometimes they call them a Chinese elm. We've got some of those. Probably 3/4 of what we have that are elm are a red elm variety. And they're good for firewood. They're good for logging if you do log of woods. Red elm is makes pretty lumber also. The branches on these, as you can see, there's a lot of branches. As it does die though, it'll shed these small ones, and it'll retain the top 20% or so. It'll retain all the top ones, but not, see there was a branch here and here and here and here. It won't retain these as it dies. These little ones will shed, and it just loses its bark and starts to dry out. So I know some people have asked why you don't mark the trees, and you can. We don't need to, because we know what a maple tree is, I guess. Most guys that tap trees, I would guess, after your first year. A maple tree, or if it's not a maple tree, it doesn't drip after the first day, or the first time. A lot of times when we're tapping, if it's warm that day, if it's your first day that's 35 or 40, as soon as you drill, it'll start to drip. But we know what a maple tree is, I guess. That's why we don't mark them. But you sure could. You could go out, you could put a ribbon around it if you want to. It wouldn't matter. Or put a little paint mark on it. And somebody brought up a question, what other trees, or is there other trees you can tap? You can tap box elder. That's in the same family as a maple. There's different maples. We only have a hard maple in our woods, but there's a red maple and a silver maple. And I'm not sure the difference in those. We don't have them, so I'm not familiar with them, but I believe a hard maple has got more sugar content. And somebody can comment on this. I think a sugar maple has a better sugar content to it. Oh, you can tap birch. I had an uncle named Lurch. You can tap birch trees. We don't have those in our woods, so I don't. These other trees we don't tap, so I don't know that much about them. But birch I think, makes a real sweet syrup and a real light syrup, from what I've heard. There's also black walnut that you can tap, and a few neighbors have tapped some of those. They've got a different season to those, I believe. You can tap those in the fall, if I'm not mistaken, and in the spring again. And I don't think they give as much, but their syrup is worth more in the end because it's a smaller quantity of it. So that's our identifying trees for 2022. So if you would subscribe to us and follow us along, we're going to be doing another video. The next one will be tapping trees. And after there, maybe it might be, if we get some snow before we do start to tap, we'll have to go out and clear some trails again with a skid loader. We'd rather not have to do that, but if we can get through with snowshoes or skis, whichever, and not have to put a trail through the woods with a skid loader, it's a lot easier. So we'll be tapping, and then after that, shortly after that, we should be boiling sap within a month, I would guess. So that's the fun part. So subscribe, hit the like button, ask questions, and thanks for watching.